morning, historian. Today we're going to talk about how the transportation in our country, particularly that of railroad transportation, is intrinsically tied to the growth of industry in our country, the growth of making things in factories. So when we're talking about the late 1800s into the 1900s, America has changed. It's not any longer the women folk making cloth and sewing their own clothes. By the mid to late 1800s, most people go to a store, buy what they want, just like we do today. Moving along here, we need to get some vocabulary in when we're talking about resources, products, and market. First, some vocabulary. You need to know what a resource is. And resources are the things needed in order to produce goods and services. And resources fall into three categories. You guys are great with natural resources, those things that come directly from nature, the ores, the coppers, the leads that the miners are pulling out of their mines. Those are natural resources. Of course, human resources are the people. They are the miners, the railway workers, the factory workers who are making the things that are going to market to sell. And finally, there are the capital resources. And capital resources are the goods made to produce other goods and services. In other words, the tool. In our examples down here, all of these factory machines that are used to produce, those would be your capital resource. Products are the things that are being bought and sold. And one of the big ways that changes in the late 1800s are mail order catalogs. They have now become big business to getting products to the people. You can buy almost anything you could ever want out of a catalog. You could even buy a house through the Sears catalog. Now, of course, they wouldn't send you a whole house. They would send you everything that you would need to build that house. And they would deliver it to you on a flat railway car. You would take your wagon to the depot, pull everything off, and then it might take you several trips to get back and forth, but you could get what you needed home, build your house. And as you see on the advert here, to save $500 to $2,000 on a complete house. Another big company was that of Montgomery Ward, and they were a brick and mortar company for a long time, and they, like Sears, would sell just about whatever you could imagine. Market is any place where buyers and sellers meet. It can be a physical brick and mortar store or a virtual market like Amazon or eBay today. But markets are just places where buying and selling happen. The growth of railroads really fuels this growth of industry. And in 1840, there were only about 3,000 miles of track in the United States, and most of that in the North. And remember, that was one of the North's great advantages in the Civil War, was that they had lots more railways to get soldiers and materials wherever they needed to go. 20 years later, 1860, railway had expanded tenfold across the country, and there were 30,000 miles of track. Railway were able to link most of the nation's major cities and towns. This is going to jump even more in the 1870s after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad is, as the name would imply, trans means across the continent. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed at Promontory Point, Utah in 1869, May 10th, 1869 to be exact. They now link the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast of our country. As well as linking the coast, it also opened up large parts of the central United States, the Great Plains region, to people who wanted to live there. Even up until the mid-1850s, if you were going to go and move out to the plains, it was still a long, arduous trip that took lots of effort. You did it by wagon. To get out there took a few days. By the late 1800s, when we had better railway travel, if you remember, we talked about, the Oregon Trail, the settlers moving out west. It took 6 to 8 weeks on a good trip. And now you can do it in probably about a week. Okay, and here you can see this is the Transcontinental Railroad. It starts in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and connected to already existing lines. And this is the Union Pacific Company. They start out here and they move west. The Central Pacific Company, they start in California and move east. So you can remember the Central Pacific starts in California. Match the seas and you'll never get that wrong. And here is Promontory Point, Utah. So when we talk about moving natural resources, railways are the way that we do that, especially as we said, things like copper and lead. And here is a Michigan copper mine from the late 1800s. And that copper and lead needed to get to factories which were largely in the east. Okay, copper and lead mines in the west are shipped by rail to eastern factories. That's the simplest that you have to know. One of the other big industries that comes along is that of the steel industry. We have to move iron ore, that's just the raw materials of what comes out of the ground, to these steel mills where they can be refined. The ore was mined and shipped by rail to sites of steel mills like Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, which become the center of the steel industry. And steel grows in this country because we adopt something called the Bessemer process. It was named by a fellow by the name of Charles Bessemer, and it allows iron and coal to be converted cheaply and quickly into steel. So what happens in the Bessemer process is they melt this iron ore and then they blow hot air through it. And it's like literally blowing air into a fire. It raises the temperature significantly and it blows off all the impurities. Okay, so if you've ever seen like a cast iron pan that your mom or your grandma might cook with, that's just rudimentary iron. There's a lot of impurities in there. And when you get rid of those impurities in iron, it becomes steel, which is significantly lighter and stronger than just regular old iron. And it allows manufacture of a variety of products. Things like wooden bridges are going to give way to steel bridges now. Buildings like skyscrapers are going to get developed because I can now go much higher with my building than I could with a wood structure. Certainly, as we develop the railway industry, that, the rail cars, the rails themselves are all made of steel. And America is just hungry for this metal. And now we can do it much faster and cheaper than we ever could. And so steel becomes sort of this wonder material that we can build almost anything out of. Only we can remember that Pittsburgh was the center of the steel industry because the football team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and in fact, these three little stars here, the yellow, the red, and the blue, are the symbol for the company U.S. Steel, which funded a lot of the startup of the Pittsburgh Steelers football team. We've got the raw materials to the factories. The factories have produced the goods, and now we need to get those finished products out to the consumers. So all across the country, you have these little rail stations popping up, and that allows this network of rail transportation of goods. Like we said with the house, you could get almost anything shipped to you and it would get offloaded at the rail station. Sometimes it was a tiny little shed. Sometimes, like this example from 1910 in Tucson, Arizona, it was a significantly large building. But either way, it was a place for goods to be put on the train, taken off the train, and consumers could pick up their purchases there. So railroads allowed the producers to ship raw materials to their factories. Manufactured goods were produced in those factories, and the finished goods were sent out to national markets. That just means markets all across the United States. If you lived in Michigan, Arizona, Florida, you could now get things through this network of railways. To recap real quick, transportation of resources, moving natural resources, especially iron ore, and the transporting of finished products to their markets. Certain cities across the country become centers of manufacturing of particular goods. And you need to know where a few of those manufacturing areas are. So the textile industry is the first industry that really develops in the country, and textile simply means the making of clothing and cloth. And you can see here, this is a New England textile factory. They like to hire children because they could pay them less. The children were considered fairly expendable if they got hurt, and the children were able to get little fingers and little bodies into places to load machines and fix machines that adults just physically could not do. In those days, there were no labor laws the way we have today. So child labor, especially in factories, in the mining industry, there was a lot of child labor because the children could get into tighter spots down in the mines the way that, because they were smaller. Textile, clothing, and cloth is centered in New England, particularly Massachusetts, around Boston. Those were major centers for the textile industry. And here you can see on the map, you've got your New England area. There's Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. This is the New England area. With the invention of the assembly line by Henry Ford, automobiles become quick and cheap to make. More people can afford them and more people want them. He starts his factory in Dearborn, Michigan, which is a suburb just outside of Detroit. So Detroit, Michigan becomes the home of America's automobile industry. That's why it's called Motown, the Motor City. And you can see here on the map, here is Michigan. It's easy to find because it's the mitten on the Great Lakes. And in the southeastern corner, there is Detroit. The steel industry, as we've said, is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant, rises up from being a bobbin boy in one of these textile factories to becoming the richest man in the United States, and arguably one of the richest men in the world. Carnegie buys a steel plant called the Homestead Steel Works just outside of Pittsburgh. He makes it part of his Carnegie Steel empire, and later this becomes U.S. Steel when Carnegie sells his operation. And finally, meat packing. As we said in the last video about cattle raising and refrigerated train cars, American standard of living is increasing and they want meat. They want particularly beef. And so Chicago, Illinois becomes a hub for that because it was already a railway hub, and they can pack the meat there, put it in these refrigerated cars, and send it wherever on the East Coast they want it to go. So meat packing in Chicago. So textiles in New England, automobile, Detroit, Michigan, steel, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, meat packing, Chicago, Illinois. And that's it for us for this video. And so we're next time going to talk about how the reasons why people wanted to go west and the impact of all that westward expansion and all this railroad expansion on the Native Americans. And we'll see you then.